Hi guys, Ali Maxwell here. The following clip is a section taken from Zonal Marking, which is the podcast that I host alongside the Athletics tactics guru, Michael Cox. And you can listen to the rest of that weekly show for free wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, ad-free when you subscribe to The Athletic. Hope you enjoy it. Michael will start by taking a look at some of these sort of individual match stats which get widely used. What winds you up most in this category?
I'm looking forward to this pod. It's like Room 101 just for stats, isn't it? It's very exciting.
Get it off your chest.
So one I saw recently that I found frustrating was I was watching Leicester's 3-0 defeat to West Ham the weekend before last, I think. And obviously Leicester was struggling in that game. Jamie Vardy was not having his best game. And the stat came up saying that he'd had the fewest touches in the game. And the commentators used that as evidence that, you know, Leicester weren't playing well, Vardy wasn't playing well, which I kind of get. But you only had to go one game back to the performance against Manchester City, where Leicester won 5-2. And in that game, Vardy also had the fewest touches and he ended up with a hat-trick. Now, 2 goals in that hat-trick were from the penalty spot, so he wasn't necessarily having his best ever game in open play. But I think sometimes we need to accept that there are different players who are always going to have a different number of touches. And Vardy, I'd say, is the ultimate example of a player who generally just lingers on the shoulder of the last defender, isn't going to be too involved in build-up play, and really focuses his energy on going in behind and scoring goals. And I think there's various quotes from Vardy and Rodgers explaining that, his rejuvenation almost under the current manager is partly because Rodgers told him to just channel his efforts on doing what he does best. And therefore, I don't think it makes sense to pick out his number of touches and say that's why he's not playing well. I'd happily have Vardy having 10 touches in a game if 3 or 4 of them are in behind the defence on the end of a through ball. That's just his game.
I mean, I dare say that there are quite a high percentage of matches that Jamie Vardy plays in where he has the fewest touches on the pitch. It's almost a sort of, it almost sums up his role and his profile as a striker pretty well there. I suppose also on this, what you're really saying is, again, if you're using a stat, especially picking out one stat and using that as some sort of proxy for performance, good or bad, you need to be consistent with how you're using it, basically. You can't just take one stat from one game in isolation, not look back at all at any previous history of that player and that stat before making your mind up.
Yeah, definitely. And there's other examples to use here. I mean, one I see sometimes is that if a side hasn't played well and they've played 2 forwards, people look at the number of passes they've played to each other, and it might only be 1 or 2, and they use that as evidence that those 2 players don't play well together. Well, I mean, the best striking combination or best forward combination so far in the Premier League this season, I think we can all agree, is Harry Kane setting up Son Heung-min. That's contributed to 6 goals for Spurs so far this season. But you look at that 6-1 victory over Manchester United, where obviously Spurs were brilliant going forward. Kane only passed to Son twice. One of those was the assist. I think there was another kind of fairly unimportant ball midway through the second half. But yeah, I mean, that was the extent of their combination play. Some of these things in terms of attacking, they only happen once or twice per game, if that. And I don't think you can really just point to a lack of involvement and say things aren't working. That's just what attacking players like sometimes.
Tom Warville, you want to launch what can only be described as an assault on the very concept and use of assists. Tell me why.
I feel like I'm already on the back foot. So the assist stat is obviously one that has been an ever-present and has been collected for years, going back to, I think, when the Premier League started in 92-93. I'm going to explain what an assist is for those that don't know. But essentially, it's the final pass played to the scorer before they go through and shoot and score. And I think that to some extent, assists aren't a great measure of creativity. They're just a good measure of passing, and actually have little to do with actual creation of chances or creation of space or all those other things that kind of matter on a football pitch that help you score a goal. And there was a great example this Monday night, actually, when Wolves beat Leeds 1-0, and I think Max Kilman passed to Raul Jimenez, and it was a fairly basic pass. It was nothing spectacular. And Jimenez kind of picked the ball up, ran out wide, cut centrally, chopped back, attempted a shot on goal, which wasn't overly spectacular, and it was headed into his own net by Calvin Phillips. Now, the shot was on target anyway, so it goes down as a goal for Jimenez, and Max Kilman gets the assist. And obviously over the course of a season, maybe there's only a few of these and they don't show the actual underlying quality of how good a creative player is at creating chances. But I just feel that the assist stat isn't the best stat to kind of measure creativity, and there are various flaws such as that one, which mean that there are definitely others that do a far better job.
Two follow-up questions to you here. Firstly, you're going to give me some alternatives, some ways that you would prefer we used statistics to, I suppose, measure or analyse creative players, or at least rank creative players, which I suppose is a lot of what statistics is used for. But first and foremost, just with the assist and how it's decided, would you like to see a move towards what they do in basketball? I think it's an interesting comparison. In basketball, they still use the word assist, and to all intents and purposes, it is similar to an assist in football. But actually, it's almost subjective. There is some judgment involved in deciding what is an assist in basketball. And to use that example of Kilman to Jimenez, that would not be given as an assist to Kilman, because his pass to Jimenez almost didn't directly set up Jimenez to score. There was so much that had to happen after that for Jimenez to actually have even a goal-scoring chance, let alone actually score. So do you think there's any reason why we should maybe tweak what we mean when we say assist?
I think that there's one kind of main reason why we don't really touch the assist definition. It's not really messed with, and it's probably better to find new and better stats to measure, and that's just because being able to compare historically across all the games in all previous seasons is such a powerful thing to do. And I think that there are very few sports where you can actually go back and compare. Definitely assists, because assist is kind of the first fancy stat, I'd say, that we have after goals and also number of shots maybe. So I think that's probably the reason why they don't, or the assist kind of like definition isn't tweaked. Now I know that Opta and others do collect and tag kind of an assist, whether it is intentional or not, which again I think is a useful thing to have. But also, if you have a person who's collecting the game deciding if a pass is intentional or not, you're not actually in the mind of that player. You actually don't know whether they intended for the recipient to score or not. So there's obviously a layer of subjectivity added onto this additional qualifier or tag, which is in and of itself subjective as well. So I think in terms of it wouldn't change the definition, but I think there are a couple of things that people can use instead, which are more reflective of creativity, and I think that a few are pretty basics. I mean, just looking at the number of chances created, I think is arguably better than assists at times, because there's not this outcome bias that the shot has to go in and be scored. And there are certain players, like I think Mohamed Salah's currently averaging 3 chances created a game, and of those 2.6 of them are in open play, and that's good enough for 7th in the Premier League this year, and he doesn't have any assists. So I think straight away, like that's one that probably isn't wholly groundbreaking, use chances created, not assists. But I think that's one good example. And then the next is the quality of the chances created from those passes. So we can look at kind of the XG at the end of a chance that's created and give that to the player who provided the chance. So Harry Kane this season is averaging kind of 0.59 XG from his passes, which is the highest in the Premier League, and obviously some of those have been really nice balls from deep to Son. After him it's James Rodriguez at Everton, 0.44, and then the next 3 are kind of quite interesting. You've got Ryan Fredericks at West Ham, which I'm gonna kind of spin round my small sample size flag and say that's maybe a reason for that, but he's joint with Alan St-Maximin and Jack Grealish, who traditionally are probably players who are thought of as quite flashy and maybe don't have the finishing product and the actual creative output, but in the small sample of games this season they look like they are walking the walk and talking the talk.
Interesting. Michael, you're not as fussed about the debate surrounding assists as Tom. What would you say to Mr. Warville, who really does want to take on assists?
No, I completely understand what he's saying. If you're trying to measure an actual player's level of creativity and maybe how that will be replicated in the future, I just think it's one of those things where I quite like the stat as a kind of, in simple terms, saying that happened. If a player has assisted a goal in the last 5 games, I think that is interesting. It's not necessarily saying that he will continue to do that or that he is the best creator in the league. It's just, to me, it's not that different from saying who scored the goals. It's just a kind of factual representation of of that player playing the final pass, even if that pass, like the Kilman one, wasn't necessarily particularly incisive. But I agree with the general thrust of his argument. And I mean, when I was first introduced to the concept of expected goals and expected assists, the concept of expected assists kind of made almost more sense to me than the concept of expected goals, because it's like, you're not responsible for what the striker does with the pass once you tee it up to him. That's your job done. You can take the measurement from there. So no, I completely understand with what Tom is saying.